Hey guys, thanks for all the support in the last video. I really didn't think I was going to get much likes. If you would like to see this continued, please leave me a comment, send me a message, tell me that you want to see it continued, or else I probably won't. I have to admit that even though I took French in my life, I can't pronounce a lot of these words, so I apologize for the French misspeaking. Also, there's a good chance I may not edit this, so I'll probably be pausing a lot and tripping over myself. So, I'm sorry about that. I claim no copyright to this. This is totally the work of Susan K. I don't want to get sued. This is only post for the people who want it. Yeah. So be gentle, I don't know what I'm doing. And this book is kind of hard to read at night. I apologize for making this at 12:46 in the morning. Anyway, where was I? Where are you going, Mama? I paused in the act of fastening my cloak and turned to find him standing in the doorway. You know perfectly well why I go every Sunday, Eric. I'm going to Mass with Mademoiselle Perrault, and you must stay here until I come back. He twisted his fingers around the handle of the door. Why must I always stay here? He demanded suddenly. Why can't I come with you and hear the organ and the choir? Because you can't, I said sharply. I was beginning to wish Father Francois had never told Eric about the organ and the choir. I had no peace since his visit last week. You must stay here in the house where you will be safe, I added. Safe from what? He challenged unexpectedly. Safe from... Oh, stop all these silly questions. Do you hear? Just do as you're told and stay here. I won't be let long. I swept out, pushing him before me with one gloved hand and locking the door of my bedroom, as I always did whenever I left him alone. It was the only room in the house that contained a mirror, and he was forbidden to go in there. But I did not trust his obedience to last once I was out of his sight. He was insatiably curious. He followed me down the staircase and sat forlornly on the bottom step, watching me through the mask. What is it like in the village? He asked wistfully. Is the church very beautiful? No, I lied hastily. It's very ordinary, quite ugly in fact. It wouldn't interest you at all. All the village is full of people who would be unkind and frighten you. May I come with you? I promise not to be frightened? No. I turned my back to him, to cover my alarm. The threat had never failed to silence him before. I was concerned to find that his obsessive love of music was now strong enough to overcome a fear I had steadily fostered since he was old enough to talk. My instinct was to protect him from a world which would inevitably seek to do him harm. Even Marie and Father Francois agreed that I must keep him away from people, and total isolation seemed to be the only answer to my dilemma. I knew that ignorance and suspicion would destroy him. Careful as I had been not to parade his presence, my windows were still smashed at regular intervals, and more than one ugly, abusive letter had been pushed through my door, advising me to leave Boscherville and take the monster with me. It took enormous courage for me to face the grim, unwelcoming silence of the congregation every Sunday. To sit in the rear pew with Marie and hold my head high, pretending not to notice the primitive hostility around me. Nobody wanted me here. But my presence was a mark of my defiance, a symbol of my refusal to be driven from my home and hounded from one village to the next. It was also my one escape from a house I thought of increasingly as a prison. My house. That quaint and pretty house of which I had been so proud was now no more to me than a dungeon in the Bastille. Returning from Mass, the first sight of its ivy-clad walls was enough to make my heart sink. But the thought of the child behind its carefully locked doors, waiting patiently and trustingly for my return, always forced my lagging footsteps down the garden path. Lately, as I approached, I had been aware of the white mask pressed against the window of the attic bedroom, and I sensed his growing anxiety that one day I would walk out of the house and never come back. "Don't sit on the stairs," he said harshly. "Go and study your text for the day and then copy it out." "I don't want to." "I'm not interested in what you want to do," I replied coldly. "I expect to find it finished by the time I return." He was silent as I reached for my purse. Then suddenly he announced with decision, "I am not going to study my text. I'm going to make it disappear so that you can't find it. Like the scissors. I can make anything disappear if I want to, Mama. Even a house." He jumped off the stair and ran past me into the drawing room, as though he expected to be hit. And when he had gone, I leaned against the wall, trembling with apprehension. I tried to tell myself that this was just a silly, childish threat, devoid of any meaning other than vain protest. But I could not stop shaking, and I found myself unable to step out through the door. I was afraid to go now, afraid to leave him in his strange, unchildish devices. I dared not think about what terrible means he might contrive to make this house disappear. When I had regained my composure, I took off the cloak and walked into the drawing room. I found him sitting on the rug before the fire with Sasha, staring fixedly at the flickering flames in the hearth. "I've decided not to go to Mass today," I told him unsteadily. He turned to look at me and clapped his hands in unveiled satisfaction. "I knew you would," he said, and laughed. I had been his jailer, now he was mine. I felt as though I had been sealed up in a tomb to serve as the corpse of a child pharaoh in its afterlife, and I fiercely resented the captivity which he forced upon me. Love, hatred, pity, and fear circled around me like carrion crows, spinning me wildly from one peak of emotion to another, until I hardly knew myself anymore. When I looked into that solitary mirror that adorned my bedroom, I was thin and haggard, with a strange, wild-out look, and through the contours of my beauty remained, I looked 10, 15 years older than my 23 summers. It was as though all the harshness and cruelty which I was driven to show him etched itself, line by line, upon my face, a grim testimony to the endless circle of violence which characterized our life together. It was during the last year that he began to explore the mysterious power of his voice. Sometimes, almost without my noticing, he would begin to sing softly, and the hypnotic sweetness would lure me from my tasks and draw me to him, as though by an unseen chain. It was a game he played, and I came to fear it more than any other manifestation of his curious genius. I put away the operatic scores which he had studied together and refused to teach him any more, for I had begun to be afraid of the manner in which his voice was manipulating me. It seemed evil somehow, almost incestuous. Father Francois now came regularly to celebrate Mass in my drawing room and spare me the ordeal of appearing every Sunday in church. And that first time he heard the child sing, I saw his eyes fill with tears. "If it were not blasphemy to think such a thing," he muttered slowly, "I would have said I heard the voice of God here in the very room." In the tense, resounding silence that descended, I felt my own heart beat thundering in my throat. I saw the eyes behind the mask meet mine, and their glance was triumphant, somehow masterful. He had heard, and worse, he had understood. I dared not think what he might begin to fashion from that knowledge. I shivered as Father Francois beckoned me forward, and told him solemnly that he possessed a rare and wonderful gift. I wanted to scream, but I was silent. I knew the damage was already done. They walked together to the piano, the priest's hand resting on the child's bony shoulder. "I should like to hear you sing the Kyrie, Eric. You know the text, I believe?" "Yes, Father." How meek he sounded. How innocent and vulnerable he looked. Standing beside the heavily built priest, for a moment I doubted my own senses. I wondered if I was feeding on brain-sick fancies brewed by this penile solitude. Why had I come to fear the extraordinary bell-like purity of his childish treble? Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Lord have mercy upon us, Christ have mercy upon us. 3 times he sang the invocations to heaven, and, with each phrase, my will receded before a wave of aching longing that made me long to reach out and touch. Whatever spiritual ecstasy Father Francois derived from those throbbing notes, my response was utterly and equivocally physical. Those words were for God, but the voice, the exquisite, irresistible voice, was for me, and it pulled like a magnet somewhere deep and unseen inside my body. Before the next phrase took breath, I slammed the lid down on the piano with a violence that narrowly missed trapping the priest's fingers. The sudden appalled silence was broken only by my hysterical sobbing. Father Francois looked at me in amazement, but in Eric's eyes I saw fear and great misery. "You are overwrought," said the priest briskly, as he pressed me into a chair. "It is understandable. Great beauty is often perceived by human senses as pain." I shuddered. "He is not to sing again, Father. I will not permit it." "My dear child, I can't think that you mean that. Forbidding expression to such a gift would be positively unkind." I sat upright in the chair, staring beyond the priest at the child, who now wept silently beside the piano. "His voice is a sin," I said grimly. "A mortal sin. No woman who hears it will ever die in a state of grace." As Father Francois recoiled from me in horror, one hand strayed instinctively toward his crucifix, while the other gestured abruptly for Eric to leave the room. When we were alone, he looked down on me with an odd mixture of pity and distaste. "I think you have been too much alone with your burdens," he said quietly. I bit my lip and looked away from him. "I think I'm mad." "By no means," he said hurriedly. "But certainly it would seem that your judgment has been affected by the strain of your solitude. Whatever you believe you hear is only the voice of your own confusion. You must try to remember that he is just a young child." I got up and went to the bureau which stood in the corner of the room. A shower of papers trembled out when I opened the glass door, and from the pile at my feet I snatched up a handful of musical scores and architectural sketches, and pushed them into the priest's hand. "Is this the work of a child?" I demanded coldly. He took the papers to the light and examined them carefully. "I would not have believed it possible for a child of his age to copy with such astonishing precision," he said after a moment. "They're not copies," I said slowly. "They're originals." He turned to protest, but was silenced by my expression. Placing the papers on the table, he sat down in a chair and stared at me in awe as I stood clasping my hands around my arms and shivering. "It frightens me," I whispered. "Too much, too soon. It isn't natural. Can't believe such gifts are heaven sent." The priest shook his head gravely. "Doubt is the devil's instrument, Madeleine. You must close your mind to it and pray for the strength to guide the child's soul to God." As he leaned forward to take my hand, I realized that he was trembling. "I have been remiss in my calling," he said feverishly. "I will come as often as my duties permit to instruct him in the doctrine of our church. The boy must be taught very quickly to accept the will of God without question. It is extremely important that the genius of this stature is never permitted to stray from the teachings of our Lord." I said nothing. The priest's intense uneasiness was merely a grim echo of my own growing certainty that the forces of evil were steadily closing in and around my unhappy child. I felt desperately in need of guidance of the church, But the inner light of conviction was no longer there. The harder I prayed, the less hope I had of being heard. My crucifix was merely a cunningly carved piece of wood. My rosary just a meaningless string of beads. My faith had weakened to the point where I allowed myself to be seduced by a sung mass rendered shamelessly and sensually beautiful. I had sunk to a wickedness that I dared not even confess. "Tell me what to do," I said in despair. "Show me how to keep him from evil." The fire fell into ashes, and as we talked long into the night, the priest warned me very seriously against any attempt to muzzle Eric's unique talents. "A volcano must have its natural outlet," he said mysteriously. "It must not be driven in upon itself. If you feel that you can no longer train his voice, then you must permit me to do so. Let me teach him as though he were any other chorister in my choir. I will steep him in the music of God and the ways of the Lord, and in time, heaven will grant you only pleasure from his voice." I stared at the sad, gray remnants of the dead fire. How could I tell him it was a pleasure that I feared?